Okay, welcome everybody to this very, very exciting Catalyst seminar. We first have Joe Calabrese, who is a reader in medical anthropology here at UCL, presenting on social context, cultural ideologies and cultural tools and their impact on youth resilience. Joe's research in medical anthropology combines ethnographic and clinical frames of reference to develop a culturally inclusive understanding of health and illness, especially in the areas of mental health and understandings of normal. He's got a varied training, including some clinical training in the States. And I think this would be a really, really interesting talk and very different from perhaps what we have normally seen. So I think this is one of the really, really important functions of the Catalyst seminars, is connecting different parts of UCL, people working in different research traditions using different methodologies. And hopefully as we get exposed to different ways of approaching the issues of mental well-being and mental health, we will be able to think about sort of more innovative and creative ways of coming together to study well-being and mental health. And Joe will present for about 45 minutes, and then we have Lissy Mitchell providing a response to the talk. Lizzie is a young person advocate who's been involved in advisory capacity on a number of children and young people's mental health initiatives, most recently in the really important UKRI Adolescents Mental Health and Developing Mind call. She's also a psychology graduate who just completed her degree at the University of Leeds and has a wealth of experience in engaging with different audiences as a sort of a young person's voice about mental health issues. And obviously Liz does not pretend to speak for all young people, but it will be really interesting to get her perspective in response to Joe's talk. And then after that, we will open the floor for questions. So Joe, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. So the last seminar by Viding and Rosenneal ended on the question of how we bring together psychological approaches and a social focus on the community in understanding mental health and the development of resilience. This question has been a central focus of my own work and my interdisciplinary identity. I'm an anthropologist interested in ethnographic research, but I'm also a trained and UK registered clinical psychologist. These interests come together in two overlapping traditions, psychological anthropology and cultural psychology. In fact, I teach a graduate seminar with that title. I would like to use this talk to apply these frameworks to youth resilience and mental health, drawing on my anthropological research with a focus on the psychological impact of social tools, contexts, and ideologies. Much recent research has supported the importance of resilience against stressors for mental health. Kalish and colleagues state, focusing on resilience rather than pathophysiology represents a paradigm shift in clinical psychological and psychiatric research. From my anthropological perspective, I'm interested in the impact of social contexts and interpretive frameworks on resilience. Within a broad diathesis stress model of mental illness, the stresses matter, just as the vulnerabilities matter. And the stresses derive from social contexts and are significantly mediated by socially shaped cognitions or interpretive framings. Social contexts may propagate pathogenic interpretive framings or framings that enhance resilience. So a crucial question for us is which social contexts and cognitive framings might reduce the overall vulnerability of young people to negative effects from stress. Professor Viding's talk focused on impairment of resilience through childhood adversity and a lack of recognition as a self-aware agent. My talk asks, what about excessive protection? Can protection from adversity, conceived very broadly, interfere with the development of resilience? First, I want to acknowledge the very real challenges faced by young people today. The NHS reports that mental illness in children and young people has increased from 1 in 10 in 2004 to 1 in 6 in 2020. And here at UCL, we've seen a lot of education-related stress in our students. However, education-related stress is not limited to the West, but it is a prevalent pattern across cultures. My most recent fieldwork site is in the South Asian country of Bhutan, where I've combined ethnographic research with volunteer clinical practice at the country's main hospital. I observed and treated many young Bhutanese who were experiencing education-related stress. The standard anthropological or decolonial narrative might immediately assume that the problem is due to Western-style education coming in with the aim of preparing students for unequal positions in a global economy. However, the reality is that I worked with several young people being trained as Buddhist monks who couldn't deal with the stresses of that indigenous path of training for an indigenous role. I discovered that the training of monks in Bhutan involves extremely long days packed full of activities and demands, not even mentioning the 3 years spent in isolated meditation retreat, which are sometimes too much for the young person's psyche, resulting in a mental illness or a suicide attempt. Both Western and indigenous education systems then can generate stress when coming into contact with individual differences and resilience, and may produce the outcomes I observed among my young Bhutanese patients: suicidal states, depressive states, dissociative symptoms, out of control behaviors. Many young people today are under great pressure to accomplish academically, creating a baseline of psychological risk. But are university policies managing or mismanaging that risk? A hugely important question is, how can we cultivate resilience in young people that allows a high quality education without unmanageable stress? The ethnographic record shows that many developmental traditions incorporate manageable doses of challenge into the developmental experiences of young people. These may include challenging tests of endurance, harsh initiation rituals, or long periods of isolation, all providing a challenge to be mastered. These challenges are importantly culturally valorized, framed as a highly significant and often sacred aspect of one's development. These traditions seem to have discovered early on something recognized by modern psychology: the fact that challenge plays an important role in the development of resilience. For example, in his identification of 5 main implications of psychological findings on resilience, Michael Rudder states as the first implication, resistance to hazards may derive from controlled exposure to risk rather than its avoidance. Anne Maston also states, it is possible that the situation of encountering little or no life stress may not be the best condition for healthy development. Some challenge may be needed to activate or optimize the development of adaptive systems. In fact, in many cases, biological systems require challenge for growth. At a basic physical level, muscles develop in response to resistance, and the immune system is strengthened in response to manageable exposure to infectious agents. Experimental studies with animals demonstrate that inoculation with controlled levels of stress leads to structural and functional effects on the neuroendocrine system that are associated with greater resistance to later stress. In terms of human psychology, diverse theories converge on the importance of challenges in the development of resilience and mental health. For example, Heinz Kohut argued that a crucial aspect of child development is the child's experience of optimal frustration, in which tolerable disappointments lead to the establishment of internal structures which provide the capacity for self-soothing. In the cognitive behavioral tradition, anxiety symptoms triggered by specific stimuli are reduced through controlled exposure to stimuli. Rudder also noted several other examples in which research found that the experience of stress or adversity strengthens resistance to later stress, including repeated parachute jumping leading to physiological adaptation and a reduction in perceived stress. So let's now bring in anthropology and the social. In her chapter on resilience in the Oxford Handbook of Developmental Psychology, Anne Maston suggests the importance of social factors. She identifies as an important question for future research, are there unique cultural practices that serve protective functions for child development? She also states that culturally based protective processes remain one of the least studied aspects of resilience. Our oldest social contexts for child development, intervention, and the enhancement of resilience are rituals. So I will briefly explore some examples from my field research. I will focus on my year of clinical practice with Native American adolescent patients at a residential clinical facility run by the Navajo tribe. This was a unique program that integrated modern clinical approaches with a variety of traditional healing rituals to treat young people dually diagnosed with substance abuse and mental illness diagnoses. As a member of the mostly indigenous treatment team, I was expected to attend a weekly sweat lodge ritual with my clients, led by one of the Native American spiritual practitioners on staff. The sweat lodge illustrates a cultural approach to resilience training through stress inoculation and the development of distress tolerance skills through coping with the physical discomfort. So in a sweat lodge, volcanic rocks are heated and placed into a circular tent. The door is closed and water is thrown onto these stones to produce steam. The ritual, which lasts 4 or 5 hours, can be a challenge to endure. As with the ancient Greek Stoics, participants in the sweat lodge develop their ability to accept their circumstances and remain unmoved. One Navajo mother described use of the sweat lodge with her own son, saying, "We started trying to teach him about his background, what happened in the past, have him understand what leaders were like, started having him to sweat lodges to be strong, learn to discipline himself." The CEO of the treatment facility was a Navajo medicine man named Hosky, with whom I became friends. When I asked him to explain why they employ the sweat lodge in their treatment of dually diagnosed adolescents, he responded, "They say there's going to be hard times in life when it's going to be very uncomfortable. What we tend to do is stay in the comfort zone. We don't want to take a risk. We don't want to make ourselves uncomfortable. But in life, sometimes you have to get out of that comfort zone to develop. We have to say to ourselves, I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to experience something different, and I'm going to push myself, and I'm going to challenge myself." So what we believe in that sweat lodge, sometimes you have a hard time, sometimes you don't. It depends really on where you're at in your self-evaluation. If I want, I can leave here, but if I do that, then I'm going to do that every time something gets difficult. So that suffering part is that kind of physical suffering, but there are all other kinds of suffering, relational suffering, spiritual suffering. So that heat, it's doing the ceremony for you. It's healing you. So my medicine man friend here is sounding quite like a Stoic philosopher, but also like a psychologist of resilience, or a DBT therapist stressing the importance of acceptance and distress tolerance skills. Hosky also seems to have an intuitive understanding that one responds to challenge in the ritual, how one responds can reframe one's relationship with challenge, relativizing other challenges in comparison, and extending a therapeutic benefit to life beyond the ritual. He said, somewhere along the way in your mind again, you're going to say, look at what's happening to me. This little thing right here, and I'm getting so upset. I sat through worse than this in the sweat lodge. This all strikes me as very consistent with psychological findings on resilience. As Rudder notes, it is important to question what are the circumstances that lead stress or adversity to result in resilience. He suggests that the key element seems to be some form of successful coping with the challenge or stress or hazard. This is likely to involve physiological adaptation, psychological habituation, a sense of self-efficacy, the acquisition of effective coping strategies, and/or a cognitive redefinition of the experience. This last aspect, a cognitive redefinition, implies a challenge to one's framing of the situation. In other words, a challenge to one's interpretations and ideas. This leads us to consider another crucial level at which challenge increases resilience, going beyond muscle growth, immune system efficacy, and coping with stress. The dialectical challenge of ideas, assumptions, and habits, which produces more accurate understanding and insight. Now I want to discuss another cultural context or tool and how it may impact youth resilience, the university. Anne Maston suggested as another important question for future research on resilience, how can educational systems and schools foster resilience? Dialectical challenge in the form of the critical evaluation of ideas seems central to the university's mission, both in terms of advancing research as well as training students in rigorous inquiry. This basic activity goes back to Socrates. However, as mentioned above, academic stress is widespread. For those of us in higher education, a hugely important question is, how do we prepare young people for the academic tradition of critical evaluation and challenge of ideas? I will discuss two notable strategies adopted by students and universities that reflect different understandings of the relationship between resilience and challenge. One very prominent pattern that we see today has been called safetyism, a cultural ideology in which safety, typically redefined as emotional or ideological safety, eclipses all other concerns. Many students today, though certainly not all, do not simply express their disapproval for certain ideas. They frame ideas they don't agree with as sources of harm and violence, either to themselves or to others for whom they take it upon themselves to speak. Students demand protection from material that might trigger them or make them feel unsafe, or that they assume will make other people feel unsafe. Some universities have chosen to adopt this way of thinking, and what had been a context for vigorous discussion and discovery has become medicalized, and the mission of the university has become blurred. What should matter most to us is that much psychological research on resilience would support the view that this safetyist cognitive framing is likely to be unhelpful and even pathogenic. Remaining focused on one's ideological safety rather than on opportunities to learn through the open discussion of ideas is likely to generate chronic anticipatory stress, which research indicates is likely to decrease resilience and exacerbate mental illness. Many psychotherapists would agree that cognitions reinforcing the view that one is under constant threat and that disagreements and misinterpretations are violence are likely to increase rather than decrease anxiety and stress. In considering the example of classroom discussion of an ancient text, Lukianoff and Haidt ask, is safety versus danger a helpful framework for discussing reactions to literature, or might that framework itself alter a student's reaction to the texts, creating a feeling of threat and a stress response to what otherwise would have been experienced merely as discomfort or dislike? Let's consider a few specific cultural tools used in this approach. First, university staff are increasingly encouraged to use trigger warnings, and some students now ask for these warnings. There's been a rush to use them without sufficient evidence that they are in fact helpful and not harmful. In fact, the empirical research that exists suggests that trigger warnings decrease resilience. As one study published in the Journal of Behavioral Therapy and Experimental Psychiatry found, trigger warnings may inadvertently undermine some aspects of emotional resilience. Another study published in Clinical Psychological Science and looking at reactions of subjects with a trauma history found substantial evidence that trigger warnings counter-therapeutically reinforce survivors' view of their trauma as central to their identity, and that trigger warnings are not helpful for trauma survivors. Trigger warnings actually prime people to perceive themselves as fragile, which is not a good thing, especially for students who may already be vulnerable. According to Richard McNally, the director of clinical training at Harvard's Department of Psychology, trigger warnings are counter-therapeutic because they encourage avoidance of reminders of trauma, and avoidance maintains PTSD. Severe emotional reactions triggered by course material are a signal that students need to prioritize their mental health and obtain evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapies that will help them overcome PTSD. These therapies involve gradual systemic exposure to traumatic memories until their capacity to trigger distress diminishes. So avoiding triggers is a symptom of PTSD, not a treatment for it. In fact, treatment of PTSD involves exposure to triggers, the opposite of avoidance. And the anxiety triggered is often seen as necessary for therapeutic improvement, which is why many clinicians avoid combining anti-anxiety medicines with exposure therapy. This is in line with what Ann Maston stated. The situation of encountering little or no life stress may not be the best condition for healthy development. Another cultural tool in the safetyist paradigm, the approach of monitoring for microaggressions, rests on a similarly questionable base of evidence. In a detailed review, Scott Lilienfeld, the Samuel Chandler Dodds Professor of Psychology at Emory University, calls for a moratorium on microaggression training programs due to the lack of evidence in support of the microaggression research program's broad assertions. The concept of microaggressions was popularized by Daryl Wing Su at Columbia, who posited a taxonomy of microaggressions in an armchair fashion rather than based on research. According to Su, microaggressions necessarily lie in the eye of the beholder. In other words, a microaggression can supposedly be identified whenever someone perceives that there may have been a slight directed against them. The claim is that microaggressions are usually emitted unconsciously by individuals termed perpetrators by Su. As Lilienfeld notes, it's doubtful whether an action that lies largely or exclusively in the eye of the beholder can legitimately be deemed aggressive. After all, referring to an action as aggressive implies at least some degree of consensus, ideally across independent observers, regarding its nature and intent. In addition, the subjectification of microaggressions leads to potential logical contradictions. Indeed, the boundaries of the microaggression concept appear at times to be so indistinct as to invite misuse or abuse. Without evidence that external observers can agree on, the presence or absence of microaggressions, item ambiguity raises concerns regarding the extent to which microaggressions can be independently verified. How can we know whether a given microaggression occurred or was merely imagined? As currently conceptualized, the microaggression research program frequently attributes malign intent to individuals without sufficient scientific justification. As Lilienfeld emphasizes, the histories of clinical and educational psychology remind us that well-meaning but insufficiently tested interventions can sometimes be harmful. Specifically, anti-prejudice campaigns that exert strong pressure on people to be non-prejudiced appear to backfire, yielding heightened levels of prejudice. These results, if replicated and generalizable to real-world settings, may bear implications for microaggression training programs. Conversely, a heightened attention to microaggressions may sensitize minority individuals to subtle slights of potential prejudice, subtle signs of potential prejudice, leading them to become hypervigilant to trivial potential slights. Such hypersensitivity might engender confirmation bias, predisposing individuals to perceive subtle signs of prejudice in their absence. In turn, these individuals may become more likely to experience negative psychological reactions following minor perceived provocations. They may also become more likely to perceive themselves as emotionally fragile. More broadly, institutional efforts to encourage individuals to attend to and identify purported microaggressions could lower the threshold for what is considered hostile or offensive, thereby generating high rates of false positive identifications of innocuous behaviors as microaggressions. If so, microaggression training programs could run the risk of exacerbating racial tensions on campus and other organizations. So as a psychologist myself, I also see many flaws and risks in the monitoring for microaggression approaches, which I've shared with my head of department and head of teaching, and which were summarily ignored. As someone who's been happily married to an African-American woman for 28 years, I'm very much against sloppy and uninformed interventions that will exacerbate racial tensions, even if done with the best intentions. I also find the concept academically dishonest. The word microaggression can be understood as an ideological tool enabling easy equivocation. The prefix micro allows the concept to be maximally inclusive of very minor infractions, while aggression allows one to claim significant violent or damaging impact from micro things like a raised eyebrow or a word taken in the most uncharitable manner possible. So microaggression is a Mott and Bailey equivocation packaged into a single word. In fact, it's remarkable these days that people are so often convinced by arguments that rely on a simple redefinition of key terms. The popular terms like microaggression or structural violence, we see that violence and aggression have been redefined to encompass areas that previously would not have been called aggression or violence at all, such as a psychological perception that one has received an emotionally triggering slight, or the mere existence of various forms of disparity in society. A psychologist named Haslam found that definitions of abuse, bullying, trauma, and prejudice have broadened since the 1980s. The concept has crept downward to apply to less severe situations and outward to encompass new but conceptually related phenomena. As echoed by Lilienfeld, a key change for the concepts was the shift to a completely subjective standard. When one subjectively feels, what one subjectively feels and what one projects onto others has been increasingly taken as sufficient evidence that some sort of abuse or prejudice has occurred. This conflation itself goes against psychological literature. As Maston states, most studies now distinguish between perceived and objective adversity. When words are conflated with actions, such as violence, how can we have a discussion about important matters on which people might disagree? What's really pathogenic is that at the same time as innocuous speech has been labeled violence, the idea that silence is violence has also become popular, perhaps in part simply because it almost rhymes. So we may be found guilty of violence whether we speak or remain silent. Even though many university leaders simply adopt safetyism, assuming it's protective without checking the research, or simply bending to the most vocal students, there are demonstrated pathologies of safetyism that we should all keep in mind. For students, safetyism is likely to reinforce an interpretation of themselves as a fragile potential victim, as well as reinforcing other cognitive distortions, increasing distress, and preventing the development of mastery, not only in the academic refinement of ideas, but also in basic forms of adult communication involving having an intelligent conversation with another person who does not completely agree with you. Here's how a student at Smith College described her induction into this sort of academic culture in 2014. She says, during my first days at Smith, I witnessed countless conversations that consisted of one person telling the other that their opinion was wrong. The word offensive was almost always included in the reasoning. Within a few short weeks, members of my freshman class had quickly assimilated to this new way of non-thinking. They could soon detect a politically incorrect view and call the person out on their mistake. I began to voice my opinion less often to avoid being berated and judged by a community that claims to represent the free expression of ideas. I learned, along with every other student, to walk on eggshells for fear that I may say something offensive. A 2020 survey of campus experiences found that 62% of sampled college students reported that the climate on their campus prevents students from saying things that they believe, up from 55% in 2019. Why are students reluctant to share ideas? Over 60% say other students would criticize my views as offensive. Nearly a third fear the professor would say their views are wrong or offensive, or would give them a lower grade because of the views expressed. Over 30% feared someone would post critical comments about them on social media. Cognitive distortions associated with a safetyist framing of higher education include all or nothing thinking, such as when all deviations from a narrow ideological position are equated with immorality or ignorance or of the one true viewpoint. Fortune telling in the prediction of negative outcomes without evidence, such as harm from hearing ideas or from microaggressions. Catastrophizing, such as when students state that disagreement is violence or that allowing debate on a topic denies a certain group's right to exist. Labeling, alleging someone who disagrees or wants to discuss certain issues as a fascist, a racist, a white supremacist, or a transphobe. And emotional reasoning, the false belief that the way you initially feel about a situation emotionally is a reliable indicator of reality. In reinforcing this safetyist ideology, university staff may inadvertently be reinforcing and modeling cognitive distortions for students, creating a feeling of constant danger and potentially facilitating rather than preventing mental disorders. For the entire educational community, the pathologies of safetyism include staff and students afraid to speak or to question the prevailing political academic ideology, staff alienation, chronic stress, and even outbreaks of campus violence in the name of safety. What are we to each other in the university? Colleagues or victims and oppressors? What happens to epistemic trust when young people are steered into ideologies that deny any value or progress in Western civilization and frame the university as racist colonial context? Ideology-dominated higher education currently institutes states of epistemic hypervigilance that put young people at risk of psychopathology. What is the culpability of universities in undermining student mental health in this way? What about staff mental health and the right to work in an environment that's not marked by unfair accusations based often on one's immutable characteristics? Several recent incidents illustrate this last possible outcome of safetyism. In 2015, Claremont McKenna College near Los Angeles erupted in disruptive protests. What triggered this? A student named Olivia wrote an essay for a student publication in which she complained about the fact that Latinas were not better represented in higher level staff positions, which made her feel out of place. In response to Olivia's essay, which she emailed to faculty, Mary Spellman, the Dean of Students, responded to her in a private email. The Dean wrote, "Olivia, thank you for writing and sharing this article with me. We have a lot to do as a college and community. Would you be willing to talk with me sometimes about these issues? They are important to me and the staff, and we are working on how we can better serve students, especially those who don't fit our CMC mold. I would love to talk with you more. Best, Dean Spellman." It seems obvious that the dean was attempting to show concern for a student who said she felt out of place and to offer time to discuss the issues. But Olivia chose to focus all her attention on the dean's use of the word mold. interpreting in the most negative and uncharitable manner possible as an indication that students of color do not belong at the college. Olivia posted the dean's private email on Facebook, adding the comment, "I just don't fit into that wonderful CMC mold. Feel free to share." The misplaced sanctimonious outrage spread among students, resulting in demonstrations, student hunger strikes, demands for mandatory diversity training, and demands for the dean's resignation. The infantile dynamics of a Twitter mob took over. The dean apologized and tried to explain what she was trying to express, but her apology was rejected and she eventually resigned. Many similar incidents have been triggered when an innocuous statement or disagreement was responded to as if it was intolerable violence that required an actually violent response by self-appointed guardians of morality. At Evergreen State College near Seattle, a day of absence was proposed in which white staff and students were asked not to come to campus in order to somehow express solidarity with ethnic minority students. One Jewish professor, Brett Weinstein, himself very leftist, expressed his opinion that this amounts to exclusion based on race and it sends the wrong message. This ideological impurity was enough for students and some staff to reframe his opinion as a harmful aggression, apply the label racist to him, and begin a campaign to dehumanize him and get him fired. In an Orwellian scene, which you can watch on YouTube, student protesters claiming to be fearful for their lives and seeking to make the campus safe from dissenting opinions, basically took staff hostage, blocking exit routes from a meeting, which soon became an opportunity for students to publicly humiliate staff. Students mocked and ridiculed the college president, George Bridges, refusing to let him go to the toilet, objecting to and mocking his use of hand gestures if he was talking, all to the gleeful laughter of students. Weinstein and his wife, also a professor at Evergreen, became continually harassed by students who actually took to hunting them at one point, hunting for them and other dissenters from the one true opinion, carrying baseball bats around campus and searching cars, until the professors were forced out of their tenured positions. The professors then sued the college and received a significant settlement, while the college subsequently suffered a 50% decrease in enrollment and a significantly damaged reputation. President Bridges later announced that he was grateful for the passion and courage the protesters displayed, and he hired one of the protest leaders to join his Presidential Equity Advisors Committee. One of their primary tasks was to rewrite the student code of conduct. Evergreen is still, I believe, looking for its next president, and it seems nobody wants the job. So in the name of campus safety, redefined to mean safety from ideas that upset them, students used actual violence, public humiliation, harassment, and career destruction, facilitated by a completely incompetent university leadership. Academic staff were left completely unprotected by their employer and at the mercy of radical student misperceptions, misattributions, and demonizations. However, there's another choice for the university and its students, which gets us beyond the pathologies of safetyism. This approach suggests that the university can learn or relearn something from traditional rituals like the sweat lodge. In the sweat lodge and in other challenging rituals, the challenge is valorized and welcomed. A shared ideology makes the challenge comprehensible. To learn through challenge is given a sacred meaning. In fact, my medicine man friend Hosky tended to see coping with challenge as necessary for learning and growth, saying that if you pray for wisdom, you're asking God to put problems in your path for you to deal with. This contrasts radically with the students described above, for whom the slightest disagreement or challenge is transformed into an intolerable and harmful assault, which to them legitimizes actual violence and destruction. To get beyond a pathogenic safetyism, we need to valorize an ethos of dialectical challenge, the challenge of ideas, while always letting students know that they're accepted as people. The second element here preserves the supportive relationships that the psychology of resilience tells us are crucial and can foster non-pathogenic cognitive framings. However, the challenge of ideas is essential in the university, and many new ideologies and redefinitions cry out for challenge. Our only hope is to challenge them. And ideas are challenged with counter-arguments and evidence rather than intimidation, violence, accusations, claims to victimhood, sanctimonious claims of moral superiority, or hatred. Maintaining such an ethos requires that we avoid conflating ideas with identities, such as when the quote, black viewpoint is taken as a monolith, which I can tell you it's not. We need an academic ethos in which the challenge of ideas is not immediately and hyperbolically alleged to be a challenge of one's group-based identity, one's personhood, or one's very existence. The view that you are not equal to your idea is often extremely useful in psychotherapy, in my experience. For example, in the deliteralization of automatic thoughts, a mindfulness-based cognitive technique. Such an ethos of valorized challenge of ideas can reframe higher education in a way that has stress buffering effects as compared to the pathogenic cognitive framings discussed above. One avoids the cognitive distortions that exacerbate mood disorders. This sort of ethos is championed most strongly at the university where I completed my PhD, the University of Chicago. This ethos is exemplified in the letters sent to incoming students by Chicago's Dean of Students, which welcomes the new student, but clarifies at the outset that members of our community are encouraged to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn without fear of censorship. At times, this may challenge you and even cause discomfort, but the commitment to academic freedom is paramount. We do not support so-called trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces. I believe this framing of a shared academic ethos is crucial. The University of Chicago lives by this ethos of valorized challenge of ideas, with interdisciplinary committees set up to systematically challenge disciplinary theories and their blind spots. My PhD was completed in the Committee on Human Development, which brings together faculty from anthropology, psychology, and sociology. I remember the atmosphere well, and I cherish the memories. I remember fellow students asking me not for a careful reading of their draft, but for a jaundiced reading in order to clarify any weak points. I remember late nights debating ideas with fellow students at the local dive bar. I remember asking professors with whom I disagreed to be discussants for my lectures. While my clinical training was supervised by a psychoanalytical clinical psychologist, Bertram Kohler, I worked for a couple years with clinicians at the University of Chicago hospitals who were real behaviorists, who read Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, and challenged my cognitive and psychodynamic models. My initial fieldwork experiences with Navajos led to a relativistic understanding of their therapeutic use of the psychoactive peyote cactus, which then led me to challenge this evolving relativist view with counter-ethnography in the form of clinical training and placements treating severe cases of substance abuse and addiction, which didn't change my mind about peyote, but complexified my understanding of this clinical domain. At the end of my studies, my wife attended my doctoral viva, and afterwards she said, in response to the vigorous and challenging discussion, "I thought these professors were your friends." However, I enjoyed the challenges because I wasn't afraid. I understood the shared educational ethos. I valued the pushback I received on my ideas, which led to more nuanced and refined conceptualizations. And I try to transmit this ethos to my students at UCL. And my favorite anonymous student reviews are ones like this one. Debating with Joe Calabrese in seminars allowed me to take my lines of reasoning further and interrogate my presumptions. I really appreciated his willingness to engage with my views, even when they were very different to his own. Socratic dialogue pursues debate for the purpose of enlightenment rather than to win. It involves challenge of ideas, not people. My cognitive framings for my UCL students often seek to decatastrophize the challenges of academic discussions and peer review. For example, I tell my students preparing for Viva about the ritual beating with sticks that often accompanies initiation rites. Van Jones, in a public event at the University of Chicago, expressed this ethos of valorized challenge perfectly. And maybe I'll end with this, this video, which really sums up my ideas perfectly. And the volume is maybe a bit low, so you might want to turn it up if you can't hear what he's saying.
There are two ideas about safe spaces. One is a very good idea and one is a terrible idea. The idea of being physically safe on a campus, not being subjected to sexual harassment and physical abuse or something like that, or being targeted specifically personally, some kind of hate speech, you are an N-word, whatever. That I think is fine. But there's another view that is now, I think, ascending, which I think is just a horrible view, which is that I need to be safe ideologically. I need to be safe emotionally. I just need to feel good all the time. And if someone says something that I don't like, that's a problem for everybody else in the administration. And I think that is a terrible idea for the following reason. I don't want you to be safe. I don't want you to be safe emotionally. I want you to be strong. That's different. I'm not going to pave the jungle for you. Put on some boots and learn how to deal with adversity. I'm not going to take all the weights out of the gym. That's the whole point of the gym. This is the gym.
So thank you, and I look forward to your discussion and of course, any pushback that you might have.
Thank you very much, Joe, for this extremely thought-provoking talk and very comprehensive and very beautifully brought a complex set of ideas together. So thank you for taking the time to so carefully present to us. And we really look forward to hearing Lizzie's response, and then we open the floor for questions. And if there are already questions, you should feel free to post them. I may not be able to put all of them to Joe, but you are no doubt able to contact Joe as well if your question doesn't come up in the Q&A time. But I'll hand over to Lizzie now.
Thanks, Essi, and thanks, Joe. I'm not too sure how I can follow that very intelligent, comprehensive talk with my comments, but I'll just say a bit about what I thought. I thought it was really, really interesting. I feel like the concept of resilience wasn't really a word that I'd heard before I started my degree, which might sound a bit naff, but I was like 22 when I went to uni and I'd never really heard of resilience before, because I feel like it's not really something that's talked about. Like, I think as a kid you get to talk about like bouncing back from challenges and stuff, but never really the concept of resilience, which I feel like builds on that quite a lot more. So I think that's kind of one of my points, is that young people, like even going to primary school, probably need to be taught about resilience and what it is and how you can cultivate it, and making the difference between like psychological safety and physical safety, like the video was saying. Because when I was a kid, I was like a bit of a rebel, and I always used to like swing on my chair in class, and I used to get told off for like risk-taking behavior and that I need to be safe. And then that kind of planted in my head that like safety was good and risk was bad. So then it kind of made me feel like I shouldn't be taking risks. That's not a good thing to do. I'll get in trouble if I take risks. Whereas actually I feel like that's a really bad thing to be teaching kids. Like obviously I shouldn't have been swinging on my chair, but I feel like it is more about the principle of how we talk to kids about risk. And I think resilience is a combination of having the challenges, but then also having the tools to cope. And I feel like young people aren't really taught those tools. I was never really taught how to self-evaluate or self-reflect. Like it wasn't really until uni that I was kind of taught that as a skill. in terms of like, say you do a piece of work and then before you hand it in, you have to do your own reflection, like writing what went well, what went badly, like what could you improve on. Whereas before that, it was just the teacher's opinion. So I feel like teaching kids how to self-reflect so they can think, what went well, what could I do differently? I think that would really help build resilience in terms of giving them their own like internal reflection on the challenges rather than having other people's opinions kind of fed onto them all the time. And I think the idea of getting it wrong and free speech was really interesting because I admittedly use Instagram and social media way too much and spend way too much time on there. And I feel like that brings about a big fear of free speech because you're scared of the consequences. Like, I think we live in a world that is obsessed with perfectionism and getting everything right. And especially since social media, we have like cancel culture, which is a massive fear. We have like hate crime and cyberbullying, and all that is quite like a instant reaction to if you get something wrong. And I feel like young people are kind of scared to say what they think if it goes against the mainstream because they're so scared of getting it wrong. And I think another skill that you should probably be taught at school is how to like challenge people in a healthy way, so it doesn't come across as like accusatory or aggressive, but it can open up these conversations and it can kind of encourage you to explore other people's views without just shouting them down. Because I feel like the culture that we live in doesn't necessarily allow for that. So yeah, I think those are my reflections.
That's great. Thanks, Lizzie. Now, are there any questions from the audience? If people are still thinking, I might maybe start with one for both Joe and also Lizzie to reflect on as well. So I think one thing that I really took away from your talk, Joe, was this idea, and this is something that I've really liked in Michael Ruther's writings as well, is that there needs to be a certain degree of almost like stress inoculation. So having too much protection doesn't actually prepare you for what you're likely to experience in real life. So in a way, like you, I have been wondering for a long time whether number of these safetyism sort of cultural phenomena actually serves to really ill prepare our students for the real world that comes after university, for the workplace, and travel and whatever activities that they might be undertaking. And in a way, what I hear from you is that the role of parents, adults, university teachers is essentially not to take the stress away, but help scaffold the management of the stress, help scaffold strategies for young people. And in a way, this is building skills for enduring mental health. So rather than actually treating symptoms, you give someone a toolkit to have agency, self-efficacy, to deal with sometimes quite challenging things in life, which we cannot take away. So I'm hoping I've heard you right there. But then I was also thinking what you saw as a solution where there are inevitable inequalities in the world, where there are, if you're a white male, you will have had an easier ride than someone who is a female or black female or so forth. And I even with my own husband, who is very feminist, still get regularly frustrated because there are things that really rile me and I feel that, this has been unfair, and he simply doesn't see it because it's not something that he has experienced. So in relation to the microaggressions, I'm sort of wondering, there's subjectivity on both sides as well. One side may see, well, this wasn't a problem, and the other side is day by day kind of assaulted by slights or someone not really getting their experience. And I was wondering what you sort of think would be the solution. And I think you sort of hinted at that, whether it's sort of, should we try and encourage a narrative where by and large people would be encouraged to assume the best interpretation as opposed to the worst interpretation, but also engage in educating other people about potential unconscious biases, which presumably we all have and we wouldn't want to deny that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the main thing I think is the cognitive mediation part of it, the way we frame things can make it pathogenic suffering, or can make it welcomed challenge, welcomed growth-oriented challenge. And I think why I think the University of Chicago ethos is so successful is that everybody is on board from the beginning with the fact that you're all accepted as people, you're all welcome, we're all colleagues, but we're going to challenge all the ideas. And that includes if I've made an insensitive comment or portrayed your identity in a certain way, then it's an attack on my idea, not alleging that I was an aggressor or that you've been a victim of violence, because it really is stretching the concept of violence and aggression quite a bit to say that about words. And if you begin to understand that you are not your ideas, you are not, the word is not something that can be violent against you. And you can then also, if I say something insensitive in terms of gender or ethnicity, that you are not attacking me, calling me all sorts of names, but you're saying, let's discuss this idea, let me critique your idea. If we have this shared ethos of valorized dialectical challenge that we're all on board for, then I'm open to that discussion. Because I don't feel like I'm being attacked personally. I don't feel like there'll be a Twitter mob dragging me and trying to fire me from my job.
Are there any questions from other parts of the audience at this point?
Just wanted to quickly, if we have time, respond to Lizzie as well. I really appreciated the idea that it would be useful to have training in resilience and emotional intelligence earlier in our schooling system, because I think that's really, really important. And often we're paying so much attention to other, passing a test or something like that. And the emotional intelligence is many other societies devote a lot of time to social and emotional intelligence. And we could really spend more time on that.
Now, Joe, why do you think that as universities, where we're meant to be all about evidence, it has been, the response to kind of some of these safetyism sort of proposals has been so non-evidence-based?
That's a great question. I don't know. It's almost like some universities are following social media. They're following Twitter opinions rather than the evidence. And it maybe that comes from the students having a lot of power. And if I had more time, I would have gone in my conclusion to the statement that I think students have a lot of power. And if they demand safe spaces and microaggression monitoring, et cetera, in a marketplace, in a corporatized university, that probably will get it. Whereas if they demanded, I want to have my ideas challenged. I want to hear the counter arguments. I don't want them to be silenced. I want an ethos where we're colleagues challenging each other's ideas, but accepting each other as people in all our diversity. I think if that caught on as an ethos among the youth, it would be very powerful, and it would possibly change a lot of universities' minds. There's a lot of power in the young people.
I tend to agree with you on a number of things, but I might play a devil's advocate. I might say, well, if you are a member of a minority and you have been constantly subject to all sorts of, difficulties from the mainstream, who don't share your experience, who don't validate your experience, might you sort of feel like, well, I'm just really tired of engaging with this. That's what I do 24/7. And I might park that there, because I can see there are other hands and I've been talking too much, but we might return to it. Mary, do you want to ask a question?
Hi. Thanks.
Hello.
For a really interesting talk. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about why Chicago has ended up where they are, and the vast majority of other universities have not. And I wonder, do you think the leadership in place has always, the culture has always been that way, and therefore this was been put in place when they saw safetyism coming, if you like, or did an event happen that triggered this? I just wonder, you know, I think it sounds very unusual, I don't know, but I just wonder why they may be slightly different, and what you think then for cultures, for universities to change the current culture. I mean, it's quite a massive thing that you're recommending, to step back from these things that have been put in place. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you should step back if you're being unethical and they're actually damaging student mental health. That's the first thing. And in terms of Chicago, I think the ethos has been there for decades. And it's not, part of it is introduced by the highest levels. There have been several reports historically that studied the issue of academic freedom and its importance in the university, at the University of Chicago. And it has caught on as an ethos with the students, which is very important as well. So, for example, you know, students made it a badge of honor when I think Chicago came. You know, they had a survey of students who were asked about how fun their campus is, and I think Chicago came like near the bottom, because everybody's about doing the work and studying and intellectual endeavors, and they don't pay a lot of attention to sports and recreation and things like that. So students made up their own shirts to commemorate that low ranking, saying that University of Chicago, where fun comes to die. So I think they really prize the attitude that we're here to study. We're here to debate ideas. As I said, the structure of the university is based around not only departments, but these interdisciplinary committees that are meant to challenge disciplinary ideas and boundaries. And so it's built into the structure of the university. It's reinforced at multiple levels, and it's caught on as an ethos for the students that they really cherish.
Great, thanks, Joe. A couple of really interesting questions in the chat as well. I think sort of almost like another side of the coin to my read's question. Izzy Cook is asking what you think has driven young people to want safe spaces and safetyism. So what has kind of driven these movements that have also then resulted in universities reacting the way they have, and in a way moving away from kind of principles of what universities have originally been for in many cases?
Yeah, I think again, I'm going to agree with Lizzie that that social media seems to have had a big impact here. I mean, it's only with the generation, the first generation to be digital natives, to have grown up with the internet in their pocket and on a smartphone, that we start to see this ideology of safetyism coming about. I mean, there are parenting styles that are very permissive that developed, but those have been around a while, and I think iGen, or the current generation that's very oriented to social media, not the most healthy way of interacting often. So there's this phenomenon, for example, called dragging that they talk about now, where everybody mobs, often anonymously. Everybody mobs the person that has disagreed with the one true opinion, and until they hound them out of the social media site, and this is being transposed into the university. I mean, we were talking about in my department, I don't know if this is university wide, but anonymous reporting of bias incidents, anonymous reporting of microaggressions, and so you don't have any ability to discuss what actually happened, but you have basically a Twitter mob dragging you because of an issue of disagreement.
There's a question in the chat from Lenny Neal, where she asks, exposed to stresses like the sweat lodge are presumably within the control of the individuals themselves, and to what extent do you think the autonomy over the stress we're exposed to is important? And could we view trigger warnings, recognition of microaggressions as chances for people to increase their autonomy over the environment, or encourage perspective taking, which can be good for mental health? I'm not sure the two are necessarily sort of mutually exclusive. So even if they, in some level, are perhaps misguided or may not achieve what they intended to achieve, do you think that might have been kind of what the original driver is?
It's possible, but I mean, a war between students and staff is not maybe the best model. I think, as I said, we can either, what are we to each other? Are we colleagues searching together? Is debate about trying to understand what the truth is? And do we have a principle of charity for each other, where we tolerate when we say slightly the wrong thing, use slightly the wrong word, or do we constantly monitor for these things to such an extent? I mean, students are rewarded and they're treated as if they're really battling the social justice battle if they're calling out very leftist professors for a slight infringements. And so when that passes for what's, anti-racism, I mean, when I think of an anti-racist department, I think of maybe something like Northwestern's Innocence Project, I think it's called, where they do research that exonerates Black prisoners on death row who were wrongly convicted. If we're going to actually be anti-racist, let's actually do it and not just strike a pose that makes us feel morally superior. So I think we have two models. We have either we're colleagues, we're working together, or we're victims versus perpetrators. And one is healthy and one is unhealthy.
Jenny, I'm going to take your question, but just a little comment there. I think that there is a sort of, again, this sense of agency and how you contextualize things. I don't give trigger warnings, but I do start my courses saying you're all adult. If there are parts of the course material you don't wish to engage it, you don't have to engage with it. And I think that this goes back to what you say about if someone has a genuine PTSD, that is, of course, something that they should seek treatment for and get help for. But that's not going to be helped. The trigger warning themselves is not going to help a serious mental health issue like PTSD. Jenny, can you ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. So as far as I'm aware, you're saying that words can't be aggressive and they're not a form of violence, and kind of framing that within microaggressions. But I was wondering what kind of evidence there is from that, because as far as I'm aware, actually microaggressions are seen by, I think there's a lot of work in the racism literature, and I know that Talon in the psychiatry department at UCL is looking at with non-binary and transgender people, and as far as I'm aware, actually they can have an accumulative effect. Like, they are very much still a violence and a form of aggression. So what is the evidence that words, as you say, can't be violent or aggressive?
Well, I mean, if they're a threat, right? If it's actual harassment, if you're using threatening language to somebody, I mean, there are already rules about that. I'm talking about what usually passes for identification of a microaggression is often very, I mean, the word micro, it tells you that they're admittedly tiny infractions, right? They're not major infractions that would rise to the level of a threat or harassment. Disagreeing with somebody on a particular element of their ideology, which they take as simple, naive realism. That's not one of these categories of aggression. I mean, for example, in the microaggression literature, somebody who calls on, I'm trying to remember, who calls, I think there's an example where if two people, a white person and a black person come into a store, if the storekeeper helps the black person first, that's taken as a microaggression because they assume the black person is dangerous, right, and needs to be monitored. But if they help the white person first, that's taken as a microaggression that shows that they care about the white person more and they're ignoring the black person. So a lot of these things are logically inconsistent, and all I'm asking for is that we don't attribute aggression to a simple disagreement or a simple psychological projection based on the fact that the person didn't act and say exactly what you would have wanted them to say, which is what's going on.
Joe, could I just sort of follow this up, because I think this sort of comes back to a little bit what I raised earlier, and I think which is important, especially when we clearly have people who have been traditionally way more privileged than other people in a society. So in a way, presumably you would be last to deny that there are people who have a lot more experience of hostility in the world growing up, and that can obviously color your perception of situations, but it can also be that you are perceiving reality, which is, there is more prejudice towards you, which can be extremely wearing. So in a way, in order to move forward, do you think that there is sort of responsibility on both sides to try and assume benign intentions, but also have this awareness that we are imperfect and we will not get it right the first time, and to try and enter some kind of a collaborative space? And then I guess the question is, to what extent do we think that the parties in the collaborative space have an equal responsibility? Do we feel like people who have traditionally have more privilege ought to have a little bit more onus in trying to redress the balance, or do we think that that's actually infantilizing people and actually it really should be a sort of a 50-50 collaborative partnership? I don't have answers, I'm just putting a few questions out there.
I mean, there's certainly histories of society and disparities in society, of course, but when we're together in a classroom, I think an ideology that says, okay, now we're all equal arguers looking at ideas is very healthy. And certainly I try to establish this sort of holding environment in my classroom. This baseline of acceptance of everyone. Now, I think that it's almost become a bad word to say you don't want to, see race. It's impossible to not see racial and gender differences. But when people, but the ideology of my generation was we get beyond those. We get beyond those to a common humanity. And I think that's a good goal. And certainly you remember that people are coming from a different background and you try to compensate for that.
Great. I would like to, we're nearly in time, but I would like to offer Lissy an opportunity if she wants to say any few words to sort of round this off before we close off today.
I can't think of anything. I just think it's been really interesting to hear all the different threads of thought. I guess I feel like it's one of those topics where there's no right or wrong, and it's just down to personal opinion. So yeah, I think it's been really interesting to hear Joe's talk and hear all the questions and comments.
Yeah, and I think that if just as a sort of bringing it back to children, young people's mental health, I think any kind of activities around student mental health that we can think about, which promote well-being, not just deal with mental health problems as they emerge, and part of which may be building resilience, is something that we should be supporting at UCL, and we're looking into doing. And I have just been pointed out that I have something that I was supposed to send to everyone. I have sent just to one person. So just a final reminder of the next seminar, which is exceptionally week and a day from now as opposed to the next month, and I hope to see many of you there. But I want to finish by thanking Joe for an absolutely brilliant, comprehensive, thought-provoking seminar, whether you agreed with all that he said or not. I hope that it's all given you food for thought, and I really appreciate this cultural context approach as well, which we haven't really heard about much in prior seminars. So thank you so much for doing such careful preparation for us. And Lissy, thank you for your really, really thoughtful response. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.